Hello, and thank you once again for listening to The Booking Club with me, Jack Aldane, where on this special episode, we bring you a live podcast recording ripped straight from the Battle of Ideas Festival in Westminster. My panel and I came together at this always energetic event to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the literary jewel that is Franz Kafka's The Trial. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Booking Club live from the Battle of Ideas Festival. I'm Jack Aldane. I'm the host and producer of The Booking Club, where today's best authors and commentators ordinarily meet me at their favorite restaurants to talk about their latest books and breakthroughs. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the publication of Franz Kafka's masterpiece, The Trial. Can we just get a quick show of hands here? Who here has read The Trial? If you can raise your hand. Pretty much all of you, at least 75%. That's excellent. Well, The Trial, as any quick search will tell you, is one of Kafka's best-known works. The reader shadows the story's protagonist, Joseph K., who is arrested one morning by an opaque authority for a crime nobody can name, least of all K himself, who, as far as we know, is completely innocent. Reading, or indeed rereading, as many of us on this panel have had to do for today, The Trial, you're soon forced to confront your own weakness in the face of unintelligible authority. Like K, you start by asking what crime has been committed. But as more characters and information enter the picture, that question is superseded by another. What ultimately is going to happen to Joseph K? It is in that transition from demanding an explanation to seeking resolution that Kafka shows you how you too might be broken by a tyrannical bureaucracy. So The Trial is relevant today in ways we wish it weren't, but such is the power of Kafka's vision that a century on, the word Kafkaesque, describing that nightmarish sense of helplessness an individual can feel when confronted with illogical systems of power, sits quite comfortably in our modern vernacular, perhaps too comfortably. Joining me today for this session is Nick Wallis, broadcaster and journalist best known for his coverage and subsequent publication of the Great Post Office Scandal. John Yorke, television producer and master of narrative, with an intimate knowledge of Kafka's work. And Maxie Allen, the Times radio producer, with first-hand experience of just the kind of madness that Kafka warned us about 100 years ago. Could you please join me in giving my guests today a big welcome? It's wonderful to have you all here. So, John, I'm going to start with you. Why is The Trial still relevant in 2025?
If we had a 6-hour-long podcast, I might get some way towards answering that question.
Alas, we have 45 minutes.
We have 45 minutes
with time for questions.
Indeed. It's vitally important in two ways. Partly because of what it described, and secondly, because the way it described it and the book it is. So I think you've got time just to look at those in turn. You never really understand something until you give it a name. And so what Kafka does when he's writing in 1914 is he gives a name and a voice to a feeling of what the 20th century is becoming and what it'll be. If you think about it, he's born in this extraordinary moment of rapid societal change, the fastest change ever since time was recorded. And he's moving from a small agrarian society where everybody knows each other, everyone is intimate, it's a society of trust, into a world which is becoming more disparate, further apart, you don't know who anybody is. And so he captures that, but whether it's serendipity or luck, sadly, is that world has increased and increased ever since. So with every year, it becomes more and more relevant. And that's very rare for a book to have that perspicacity. And I think there's a number of things that are worth looking at in what it does. I mean, I think the thing it captures so well is obviously the burden of bureaucracy and the appalling ridiculousness of bureaucracy, which is, of course, something we see as far back as Dickens' Bleak House. But we now living in an algorithmic bureaucracy, which of course absolutely amplifies everything he's saying. You get no sense for anything coming back. So I think that's key. I think he describes incredibly well surveillance and surveillance without license. And there's a touch of Orwell in that, but of course in Orwell you know exactly who is surveilling you. Here you don't, and you don't know why, but you've got a sense all the time that someone is watching you. Okay, so it gives that extraordinary sense of paranoia to the book. There is Mulian Kundera said a brilliant thing about the trial. He said that in Crime and Punishment, it follows a classic story shape. There is a crime and it needs to be punished. The trial is a punishment looking for a crime. And it's a really smart way of looking at it. This sense that foreboding creepiness that someone has done something wrong and it will seek you out and punishing you even if you don't know what it is yourself. And that leads to this kind of sense he articulates sort of an invisible court, a court that makes no sense but can condemn you. So it's like, if you've ever been turned down for a credit rating, you're never told why, and there's no way you can articulate appeal that, and it's that sense magnified. And I think finally, and you see this in this change from the 19th century novel to the 20th century novel, is everything is solid. And then with Kafka, suddenly everything becomes liquid. You prod something, you expect it to push back, and it doesn't. And that change is profound. So I think those are the societal ones. I can talk about the literary ones if you want as well, but we may run out of time.
No, absolutely. I mean, I wondered how long it was going to be before George Orwell was also invoked alongside Kafka. What about this distinction between the Kafkaesque and the Orwellian? Sometimes these are sort of used interchangeably. Someone can talk about having a very Orwellian experience.
I mean, I think with Orwell, what you get is the impression is intentional and ideological, whereas in Kafka, it's still oppression, but the oppression is absurd. And so Orwell is writing about evil, and Kafka is writing about absurdity. But of course, there's a Venn diagram there where they overlap. And I think it'd be interesting to see what Nick thinks of this. I was thinking about the post office scandal the other day. Objectively and standing back, it looks Orwellian because you can see a systematic attempt to punish the people who dared to complain. That's very Orwellian. But if you're trapped in it and you couldn't see that, that's Kafkaesque. And I think that's the fundamental difference. Again, Nick would be more of an expert.
Yes, well, moving on to one of the most malicious and toxic scandals of our time, Nick, you said that you reread the trial whilst writing the Great Post Office Scandal. Do you remember the moment you realised you needed to reread it in order to write that book? And what invoked it for you?
I read the book as a kid because I did literature as a degree, and so I was reading these sorts of novels, Dostoevsky, and so it was just, you read Metamorphosis and then you progressed to the trial if you were reading on a Kafka reading pathway. And everyone described what was happening to the postmasters as Kafkaesque. And I wanted to call the chapter I wrote about Seema Misra's trial, The Trial, but I thought to have the right to do so, I needed to go back and reread the book. And it was... this could be a fucking manual for the post office and the way that they treated the sub-postmasters. The way in the opening chapter those two warders turn up and start eating Joseph K's breakfast and then being over-familiar with him and then being suddenly authoritarian and then touching him. This lack of respect for boundaries and this invocation of authority whilst also trying to pretend that they're on his side. This was how the auditors treated the sub-postmasters. And the original title of the book in German is Der Prozess. And we've often said that the punishment is the process, especially people sort of caught up in the gender wars as well, where they're frozen out of their friendship groups and their workplaces and the like. And there's a couple of lines in here, so I was rereading it last night, and there were a couple of lines. You know how so many postmasters were pushed into pleading guilty because they were so scared of going to prison, and they were in this unbelievable situation where they'd done nothing wrong, but they were being advised by their own lawyers that they needed to plead guilty because that was the only way they could keep them out of prison. There's a line in this... I've put my glasses on. There's a line in the book where it says... Lenny, one of the female characters in this, says to Joseph K, you can't defend yourself against the court. You have to acknowledge your guilt. I thought, this really is the manual. And... the whole book can be summed up in another sort of rhetoric flourish by by Kafka where he says, did it not look like a torture sanctioned by the court as part and parcel of their proceedings? Again, that the process is the torturous thing. That's what people are locked up in. That's what Kafkaesque is to me. But it was extraordinary because I wasn't looking for parallels. I just wanted to enjoy it as a piece of art. And then I saw just how strongly it resonated with, and you say the way Kafka was predicting the future. This happened in living memory. This was still going on within 100 years of this book being written. This was the manual, and he saw this sort of thing coming, and it actually happened. And there's the whole thing about Joseph K. He says, well, we are in a society that believes in the rule of law. We have proper procedures for going about things. This kind of thing wouldn't happen for no reason, and yet he finds himself, never quite getting to trial for a crime he doesn't know whether he has committed or not. And that was where the sub-postmasters were. It's the parallels are so striking, it's extraordinary.
When I reread the trial for this talk, I just found myself becoming, as I did the first time I read it, increasingly angry and upset, frankly, because it's one of those stories that is so visceral emotionally as you follow this character. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, as you realize that you yourself are losing the will to ask what the hell he's done. And all you want to know is, okay, what's going to happen next? Which seduces you into realizing this is how the process gets you. You stop asking that question, that fundamental question. John, when you first read the trial, do you remember that experience?
I was 18 or 19, and of course it's a brilliant book to read at that age because it feels like, oh my God, he understands me better than anyone else because everyone is pushing back in ways that don't make any sense. So it's just a wonderful articulation of that feeling. I went back to it, probably a couple of years ago now, and I didn't have the same emotional, visceral reaction. I was asked to chair a debate, between Orwell on one side and Kafka on the other, and it's like a wrestling match. What was interesting is I found myself more emotionally seduced by Orwell, actually. For me, and it's interesting hearing you say that, the appeal of this book is more intellectual than emotional. It's quite hard to really feel what he's feeling. You sort of stand and observe and go, oh yes, I can see why you would say that. Whereas in 1984, you're sort of angry.
That's a really good point. Maxie, I'm going to bring you in here. You experienced something earlier this year that speaks directly to why this novel is still relevant. We've spoken about the post office scandal, but take it away.
Shall I talk through what happened?
Sure.
Well, afterwards, when our story became public, Kafkaesque was a word that got used here and there, and it's not too far off, I don't think. In some ways, what happened to us was quite trivial, very trivial, compared to the victims of the post office scandal. We didn't go to prison. But I think the reason why we wanted to talk about it is I'm not sure how often it happens to other people, those trivial, marginal things that don't see the light of day. Essentially what happened was, it was to do with my daughter's primary school, which is a state school and therefore a public authority. The people running it are public officials. And I'd been a governor of the school for 4 years. So I knew all the people involved, and I'd given up quite a bit of my spare time to help with the governance of the school. I'd done training courses, and I knew the rules. And I think that, looking back now, was a big part of what happened. Essentially, the November 23, shortly after I came off the governor's, the head teacher announced he was going to retire at the end of the academic year in July. So quite a lot of notice. And what the Board of Governors are meant to do in that situation is the government guidance is start quickly to advertise the role and get a new head teacher in place. And they had nearly a year to do it. And instead, 8 days later, they sent out an email saying that the deputy head would become the acting head 10 months later, with seemingly in perpetuity, with no explanation about why they were doing it that way. And I thought there's something a bit off about this. This is a bit too cosy. And I couldn't help wonder if it was a bit of a stitch-up, to be frank about it. I didn't do anything, but 6 months later, I emailed the chair of governors and said, as I'd been a governor, can you explain when you'll advertise the job and why you're doing it this way? And she didn't reply. I asked again, she didn't answer the question. I asked a final time, and she wouldn't answer the question. I asked to see copies of the minutes, of the governor's minutes. They said no. I said, what about FOI? Eventually they sent something but redacted everything to do with the head teacher recruitment process. This made me more curious, not less. And we started talking about it on a WhatsApp group, which was a private WhatsApp group. It wasn't to do with the school, set up by my partner. About 12, 15 people on it who were parents in my daughter's year, but it was our group. And I posted my letter to the governors, and we talked about the situation. And then a few weeks later, we got an email from the school saying, essentially, we've seen your WhatsApps and we don't like it, and reprimanded us for discussing the head teacher recruitment process on private WhatsApps, and threatened us with a ban from the school. And I imagine they thought we would be just sort of scared by that and shut up. But I thought, well, that's not on. So I pushed back and complained that a public authority had somehow acquired our private WhatsApps by some unknown means. We complained, they banned us from the school premises, which had quite serious implications because it's a primary school, our daughter has epilepsy, disability, she's on the SEN register, so we couldn't drop her off at school, we couldn't pick her up, we couldn't speak to any teachers, we couldn't meet to discuss epilepsy, no phone calls, no Zooms, we couldn't see her school shows or anything like that. So we pushed back quite hard and stuck up for ourselves and went through the school's official complaints process, and we offered mediation several times, which they ignored. So we pushed back hard and stuck up for ourselves. And in November 24, which was 1 year after he'd announced his retirement, and still no news, I asked again, what are you going to do? 3 weeks later, a police officer turned up at my house and said, stop contacting the school and stop asking about the head teacher recruitment. He also went to the home of a county councillor who'd separately been asking the same questions and threatened her with investigation. I thought it was a bit out of order, to put it mildly, but I was quite scared and I did what he said. Come January, the complaints process didn't work. We took her out of the school. We thought this is never going to get any better. We took her out of the school. 24th of January was her last day. 5 days later, 6 police officers came to our house and arrested us. And they searched our house. They arrested us in front of our 3-year-old daughter. They took us to police custody, where we were held for about 12 hours in total. And I think what's relevant in a way to this is the 6 coppers who came to our house, when we said what's going on, they hadn't been involved in the decision, so they didn't know why we'd been arrested. The detectives who interviewed us later that day hadn't been involved in it either. So no one we ever met knew why we'd been arrested. And when they nicked us in our house, they mentioned things like slander, which isn't a criminal offence, sending emails to the wrong address. But the notional offences were malicious communications, harassment, and causing nuisance on a school property. And when Rosalind, my partner, was interviewed separately from me, she said, what could the malicious communications have been? And they didn't know what it was. They had to look it up on their phone, what the offence actually meant. And when we were interviewed, at no point did they have any actual evidence. So they had quite a vague statement from the complainant. You can probably guess who that was. But no documents. No, right, you sent this, look at this piece of paper, you wrote this, you did that. Nothing. No evidence of anything that we could have done. And eventually, unlike the poor people involved in the post office, somebody saw reason and they didn't take it any further. But in the intervening period, we thought, well, we haven't done anything wrong, but we got arrested, so we could get charged. And that was hanging over us for quite a long time. And even now, after we told our story and pushed back on it, we still have never been shown a single shred of anything we had done.
And I believe that story made it to the front page of, was it the Times newspaper?
Yeah.
Well, there we have it. I mean, you couldn't find a more kind of vivid case study here. I suppose the questions that arise from this, and you'll have a chance in a moment to ask them yourselves, are exactly what it is about state overreach, when we use that term, that points the finger at overreaching citizens who feel that it is appropriate to ask authorities to intervene in areas that they're simply not, versus the inappropriate actions taken by the police, whose job it is to respond to a complaint. I mean, they wouldn't be doing their job if they hadn't responded in some way, which they did. But I think, would you say that when you look back, you see this as being kind of a great example of how people now reach for levels of authority that do not belong in places of civil and civic debate, and dealing with it as neighbours, as communities?
Yes, in a word. I mean, I think, in a way, the difficult but important thing about our particular story is that we still don't know what happened. So we can't explain it. We can't explain what went wrong. So in a way, I don't know. I mean, I have theories, but it strikes me that our particular experience was a case of a public authority, because a school is the same as a hospital or Thames Water or a council or local government department, a public authority getting the police to intervene to close down awkward questions. And for some reason, the police played ball with it. How much it was the school's fault, how much it was the police's fault, or both of them, I don't know. But your essential point, I think, is right, is I think we probably, on a wider level, have a culture, I think it's to do with Uber Eats and Deliveroo, I think, that you can, I want this done, I'll press a button, and someone will do it for me.
Uber cops.
So if you've got someone asking difficult questions or complaining, think, right, I'll call the police to sort them out. And that, I think, is what happened.
Nick, hearing Maxie's story, which you know well already,
it still staggers me every time I hear it. I shake my head in despair.
Nick, I would have thought nothing surprises you anymore.
Listen, every time I hear a postmaster story, there's always a new detail that makes you gasp with disbelief. And what Maxie was saying there, again, just
in Maxie's case, what stands out to you?
Well, the panjandrums at the school, who are used to having complete authority within their purview, and clearly see dissent as something that needs to be squashed, and because they don't have any actual control over you, like over parents, like they do over their staff, and to a lesser extent their pupils, they are reactively authoritarian. And two things went wrong. You're right. The fact that they did that no one has actually educated them in learning how to have a proper debate and how to take proper criticism and respond like an adult rather than like a control freak. And the second thing that went wrong was that the police went along with it. I mean, you could say with the postmasters, they were screwed over by the post office, but the criminal justice system just let it happen. And there still hasn't been enough of a reckoning within the legal profession about it. It's growing because they are starting to realise how badly they failed. But yeah, the police just jumping now, because since every crime, every allegation of a crime has to be investigated, the police are essentially all at sea because they don't have the resources to do it. And they're being shaped by political winds in one direction or another. And you just happen to be on the sharp end of it. But I cannot imagine for one moment how terrifying it must be. And then you've got to deal with all the neighbours talking and all that kind of stuff, and make childcare provisions because you've been taken down a station and then not being told properly what you've been arrested for because there's no evidence put in front of you. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 police cars. One of our neighbours, a good friend, was in tears afterwards. But I think what's relevant, I mean, I would stress again that it isn't like the people from the post office who lost their livelihoods, went to prison. In some ways, although we had a horrible few weeks, we live to tell the tale. But I think what's significant is that I and my partner, we have the wherewithal to tell our story because we're used to public life and we understand how the media works. But how often does this actually happen? And no one speaks up because the member of the public who's been under the cosh is too scared and too relieved to walk free that they keep their mouths shut. And that's why it might be that it was only us. I suspect not. And that is, I think, significant. How often does it happen? An interesting parallel, too, I think, with the post office and other scandals like contaminated blood, or you think about Stephen Lawrence or John Charles de Menezes, is that people believe a public authority inherently. If it's a public authority, people think it must be true. But an authority is run by human beings with the same foibles, the same egos, the same capacity for making mistakes as anyone else. And I think the thread that runs through the post office and other great scandals is the last thing anyone in charge will ever do is admit they might have got it wrong. And that's where the problem escalates, because they dig their heels in and you have to drag them kicking and screaming, as your poor post office victims had to do for nearly 20 years, until finally they get to the bottom of it.
I mean, there is a real problem here, and the point you made about there is a process here in search of a crime in the trial. That's what happened with you, Maxie, but I probably don't think how aware you are that if they were scrabbling around to find a crime that you had committed. Now, a clever lawyer might have decided that you had committed one. And that's what happened with the post office. They latched onto this idea of false accounting as the crime on which they could hang them, which the judge in 2019 essentially threw out as the process that created the crime was in the post office's mind. Now, if the school or the police had decided, particularly the police had decided that what the school was alleging related, cross-referenced with one of the many crimes that exist around communication, and decided that there was something they could latch onto, then you're in it. Then you're in the system, and you're in deep trouble. We are seeing, obviously, pushback about it, and Battle of Ideas is obviously part of that pushback, about free speech and about the ability to say what needs to be said, not just what you want to say, not what's insulting or rude, but it's actual important speech to keep our democracy functioning. And it is being closed down by these stupid laws and the stupid people who try to enforce them.
Well, listen, Maxie, the point you made earlier about calling the authorities on somebody the way you would order from Uber Eats or Just Eat or whatever strikes me as quite interesting, because we often say now that when you look at the predictions of was Orwell right about the future, it's often counter-argued that actually it was Aldous Huxley who got it right when he said that it isn't burning of books, it isn't authoritarian states, it isn't censorship that's going to undo us. It's going to be the things that we love, the things that we find convenient, the things that we as hyper-consumers reach for all too easily to solve our problems, whether it be boredom or offence. But John, this issue of people within a bureaucracy themselves being victims of a bureaucracy, we've heard this described by Maxie just now. This is something that comes up very much in the trial, isn't it? The fact that this isn't about the individual going up against a monolith. This is a system of individuals who are themselves powerless to stop it.
Yeah, it's systemic and it's absurd. And there is a point in the book where two of the people who were involved in the arrest of Kay are themselves found to being punished. And again, we don't know why, we don't know what for, we don't know if that's the result of Kay or whatever, because there's no logical cause and effect. It's all broken down. But I think there's something interesting, just sort of tying that together with Huxley, is 1984 is clearly, obviously, based around Stalin and the old Soviet Union. What the modern Soviet Union does is create a Kafkaesque world where nothing is true. Flooding the zone with shit, if you'll pardon the exception, is the strategy now. Peter Pomerantsev writes about this incredibly well. You just tell everybody endlessly contradictory stories, so nothing makes sense, and so you just give up because you don't know what is true and what is false, and instead you go on your Game Boy, and you play that instead because it's just a lot easier getting on with your life and minding your own business.
How many people here have been arrested?
That's a great question.
Oh, wow. It's quite impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, me.
Yeah. Have you got arrested as well?
A long time ago.
What for? Stealing a policeman's
Nothing
helmet.
I want to confess publicly.
Well, that's interesting. And so, have been arrested and have read the trial, Hans? Yeah. I mean, I can't make you share with us neither the story nor what that book means to you. But if anyone wants to volunteer that at this stage, I mean, again, this is a 100th birthday party, and cheerful as it is, I mean, the room is just brimming with festive spirit.
As someone who has spent all year trying to write a book, I was gratified to see it took Franz Kafka 10 years to write the trial. I thought if mine's as 10th as good.
I didn't quite finish it either.
No, he did. Well, I quite like the ending to the trial. It's got a certain sort of cinematic kind of brutality about it.
We should have had a cake, really. 100 candles.
A cake.
Yes.
The lady with her
Was there somebody at the back with her hand raised? Yes, there we go. Yeah. Hi.
I wondered if any of you have come across any examples of people who found the trial comforting And the reason I say that is that when I had a very, very, very mild version of the kind of things that you've been describing, I derived enormous comfort from rereading Catch-22. In fact, there was a particularly bad week where the only way I could get to sleep was by reading Catch-22. And I just wondered if that was something that resonated, because you've been talking about the trial as something, not to diss the trial, but the kind of the negative aspects of it. But there's also possibly a comforting function for this kind of literature, that you can read it and think, it's not just me. You know, this is this great classic that is describing my current experience, and that's actually really, really helpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, just speaking very briefly for myself, I first read The Trial when I was about 17, and I did find it a comforting novel to read at the time, just because I think, though John and I sort of differ in terms of how it hits us emotionally, and I agree that 1984 is the much more sort of viscerally powerful emotional novel, it did resonate with a general malaise I felt at that stage in my life. However, Catch-22 by far is, I mean, a novel I think in some way has to give you a feeling of recognition for what you're reading in your own life. It also helps if it can make you laugh. I just don't find much to laugh about in The Trial, even though Kafka is incredibly funny in some parts.
But if you listen to Alan Bennett talking about it, it's obviously Kafka is one of his heroes. Yeah, and he talks frequently about how funny it actually is, and the gap between what he says and what happens. But I mean, it's a really good thing. From the questioner, when I was 18, 19, I read it. It's that magic thing you sort of want from any book, which is, I feel seen. Somebody understands me. I mean, it's absurd because obviously I was not living in a Kafkaesque nightmare. I was living with my mum and dad in Barnes.
Yes.
It's like
I doubt it's of much comfort to you, Nick, to read it. I don't think. Or maybe it did give you comfort when you were reading.
It's like a frustrating fever dream, isn't it? Because everything's always just out of touch, and things shift form and shift. Spaces change, people change, and there's lots of transformations going on in it, which are there's no stable basis for whatsoever, and whether that's sort of reflection of a psychological state or not, it makes it narratively unsatisfying. What leapt out at me, I found it more satisfying actually reading it this time round, because I had no contact with the law when I was younger. Now I've seen how the judiciary and the legal system works in this country, and it was obviously working very similarly where Franz Kafka was writing, because the echoes and the secret language of the law and the way the courts operate and the days that they operate on and who has influence and how, he ends up he ends up petitioning a court artist, doesn't he, for some kind of favour and supplication, and that's the sort of indication of the state of desperation that he's in. And so I just found all the shifting. I just found it very, very frustrating. As we're on translation, can I just say something about this? Because this is Kafka in a nutshell. The opening line. I was reading the book and I was looking to do some copy and pasting to make some notes, and I found a free version online. And I noticed that there was a difference between the translations, which is actually really quite significant. And the first line in the Penguin Classic version is, "Somebody must have made a false accusation against Joseph K, for he was arrested one morning without having done anything wrong." Now, the translation I found online was, "Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but one morning he was arrested." And then there's a rabbit hole you can go down about the original German, because the original German, and this is forgive my accent, "Dann müsste Joseph K. verleumdet haben, denn ohne dass etwas Böses getan hätte, würde eines Morgens verheft." And apparently a lot hinges on the word hätte, which is the conditional perfect of the word have, because it's talking about what might have happened or what might not have happened, which and also there's böses means evil, so there's a moral kind of dimension thrown into whether doing anything wrong is, and so this is even in the first sentence of the book, the ambiguity and uncertainty, which comes out in the English translations, was built into the German original, and you're already, before you even know where you're going, you're on uncertain, shaky ground. And the second sentence...
I think a comfort comes in a way from giving it a name and a framework and a reference point to help us make sense of things which don't make sense. And John, you made a really good point at the beginning that it doesn't, you put it more elegantly, it doesn't exist until you give it a name. And I think giving us that name, Kafkaesque, helps us make sense of things that he did not anticipate in detail. but are part of our lives. And what you may not have anticipated is something so trivial and silly as things you do on a phone are leading to 30 arrests a week on WhatsApps and social media. And that framework, that reference point, helps us make sense of it. And I think something that strikes me in this wider conversation is that nobody joined the post office because they wanted to throw 900 people in prison. No one joins the police, probably, because they want to do stupid stuff. Or maybe they do, but it's unlikely. How does it happen? Because no one sets out to do these things. And is it the fault of the authorities? Is it the fault of everyone? Because we all participate in this game where things creep up on us and we don't realise. I don't think we know quite why it happens, and I don't think we're asking enough why.
A big part of it, I think, is power without accountability, particularly democratic accountability. People who are not the right people to be exercising power have vast amounts of power. The law is a case in point. I don't think lawyers have any idea just how much, because the law sits above us all, whether we like it or not. And lawyers are the high priests of this rules system that basically governs us all. They're the ones who bring down the tablets of stone from Mount Sinai and interpret what the law says and what the law means. And they can change lives in an instant, and I don't think they even realise that the level of responsibility they have. They certainly don't have much accountability. And then when you're looking to law enforcement, like the police, then again, you know, I remember one Tory MP saying to me off the record when the police and crime commissioners were coming in, and no one could see the point of police and crime commissioners. No one knew why they had to elect them or what they were for. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, you've got to watch the police. You've got to watch them because they are an unaccountable power base. And this is an attempt to try and bring some kind of leverage, political, democratic leverage, into this unaccountable power base.
With 2 minutes left, I'm going to wrap up with just two very quick points, and there are plenty of minutes after this for you to speak to our panelists one-to-one. I don't think the trial will ever be a comforting novel, for the simple fact that within the story, Joseph K. is always being encouraged and persuaded, or at least they're trying, these characters he meets, the lawyers, the authorities, Laney, to just get used to it, just get comfortable, just go with it. And the more that you get comfortable, or the more comfort you derive from reading the trial, the more you are falling for the tricks of the system. But the other thing too is that much as we now have a name to call it by, Kafkaesque, it would help if more people really understood what it meant, if more people read the trial, and maybe, as with the case of the sub-postmasters, Nick, we need an adaptation to screen of the trial to make this more popularly understood and for it to resonate, as it seems we rely on screen to do for us now, for the rest of the country and for the rest of the world. So I hope that we might see Franz Kafka's The Trial starring, I don't know, Matthew McConaughey.
Will Mellor? Will Mellor?
Okay. We'll let you lead on casting. Thank you very much. You can find us at Booking Club Pod on all socials. That brings us to the end. You've been a wonderful audience. Please join me again in thanking my panel. This has been the Booking Club Live. Thank you very much. We'll see you next year.